Hi, my name is Julian Carrington, and I'm a programmer with the Planet in Focus Environmental Film Festival. And it is my pleasure to be joined for a Q&A by Christy Cooper and Olivia Ahneman, who are respectively the director and producer of Youth v. Gov. Christy and Olivia, thank you so much for making the time to speak with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Julian. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure to host you. Thank you for the film as well. Jumping into questions, Christy, I know that you have made some shorter form pieces prior to this film, but this was your first feature, and it was quite an undertaking as far as first features go, obviously being a 5-year journey. I'm curious, what was the inspiration to make this case the subject of your first film, and did you foresee the possibility of the lawsuit sort of being the journey that it became ultimately?
Yeah, well, because I guess the work that I had done, 10 years ago, the short films about some young people who were suing their state governments, it was kind of my lead in to this story. I knew some of the plaintiffs from that time, and I knew the legal team, and I had been following the state cases. And so when they filed this new case in 2015, the federal case, I was kind of poised to jump onto the story. It wasn't necessarily a super conscious decision that this was going to be my first feature film that I would direct, but it was definitely a story that at the time I knew I had the sense that it would make a good story. And when the kids won their first hearing in the case, that was kind of the moment that I knew the case was going to be going further. However, I didn't know how long the case was going to take. I didn't know what kind of undertaking it was going to be. I certainly didn't know that after finishing the film, 5 years later, and now the case has been ongoing for 6 years. I had no idea that the case would still be going. So it's been a long journey, but it was definitely, as you said, a challenging first film to take on. And I'm just delighted that we're getting the story out there, and especially because the case is still ongoing.
Yeah, that anticipates my second question a little bit. But Olivia, I wanted to give you a chance to contribute. At what stage did you join the project?
I joined Christy in January of 2019, so she was about 2.5 years into the process, and so we had some shoots left to do, some of the production, but we were gearing up and moving towards post-production. And Christy had been carrying the load of the filmmaking on her own. Basically, we had some producing support, but I came on to just sort of help take over some of that and let her concentrate on getting the film finished and into the edit room.
Got it. Christy, you mentioned that the case is still ongoing. I'm wondering, how aware were you as you were making the film that in some senses your film could almost be conceived of as an exhibit in sort of a parallel case, which is being, sort of contested in the court of public opinion? And how did you set about the task of making such a mammoth set of facts intelligible and accessible to viewers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the fall of 2018, when the plaintiffs were supposed to go to trial, and we see that in the film that, there's the day of trial, and shortly before that happened, the DOJ filed a emergency stay with the Supreme Court, and they missed their trial date because of that. I think that experience, because I had moved to Eugene, Oregon. I was planning on being there for the 12-week trial. Was there with my co-producer Liz, and I think when that happened, it was kind of this big realization to me that, oh my gosh, like, this case may never go to trial. Mm-hmm. And without it going to trial, all of this evidence will never be in the public, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of the evidence that we had gathered in the research of the film, but also like all this evidence that the plaintiffs and their legal team have. And so I think after that point, it was kind of clear to me that with the story, that regardless of whether or not the case was able to go to trial, this film could serve as that evidence that would otherwise have been presented in trial, and people would understand the breadth and the scope of this case and the evidence that they have, and how long-standing this knowledge is of the government. So when we got closer to going into post-production and wanting to weave this story, and it was very clear that this historical angle was going to be a really important piece of the story, and we spent a year and a half digging into the research to actually collect all of that material that we have in the story.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, or perhaps it's more accurate to say that I can't totally imagine the process of gathering all of that material. But again, I think one of the key sort of real virtues of the film is just how successfully I think it is able to then kind of make the case to the audience, and you sort of structure it in this very deliberate and clear way. Can you maybe just talk a little bit about maybe each of you? I don't know necessarily whether there were conversations between you about sort of how you would ultimately present the information, but I think that that's one of the real just like noteworthy features of this film, is how well it again takes all of this information and kind of lays it out.
Well, thanks for saying that, Julian. That's really nice. There were a lot of conversations between me and my team, as Olivia was a big part of that, as we were finishing up in production and trying to kind of figure out how we were going to structure this story. And I think for a long time, people, really, especially early on when I was trying to get funding for the film, it was, and I was pitching, and it was like, oh my God, Chris, you're doing 3 films. You just need to focus on one of these stories. And it was always really important to me to have the 3 elements of the story that I feel we have as the plaintiff stories, which are the heart and really the meat of the story. And then of course the complicated legal case, and then all of this historical evidence. And when we sat down to edit, I was really fortunate to have an in-house residency with the Jacob Burns Film Center, and my 2 editors, Lyman and Tony, were able to come and stay at the house with me. We had our own studio to work in. And that was kind of the moment that we realized that we could actually structure our 3-act structure around the 3 elements of standing. Mm-hmm. And so the first act became about proving that the plaintiffs have been harmed. And the second act is about proving that the defendants have caused the harm. And the third act is about proving that the courts can provide redress or relief for the plaintiffs. And then once we figured that out, the storylines, it felt so much easier to blend and move between those, and to figure out where to weave in the plaintiffs and where to weave in the case, and always with everything driving the case forward. That was really the red thread that kept us together. But it was definitely a collaborative effort with my team. Olivia viewed so many cuts, providing feedback, as did the rest of our team. And I think we finally landed somewhere where it's informational. There's a lot of information there. And we had to weed out a lot of very technical legal stuff, but I think we left enough in there that hopefully it's educational and also, entertaining at the same time.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's informational, but I think it's hard not to also be inspired by the 21 plaintiffs and also Julia Olson, who I think really emerges as a hero in this effort. Obviously, your relationships with them seem very strong, as evidenced by just the wonderful access that you've had to their campaign. Can you just talk a little bit about what it's been like to accompany them on this journey, and to see them, particularly the plaintiffs, sort of grow into change makers even beyond the bounds of the case itself?
Yeah, it's, I would say that most of these kids who started in this case didn't come into it because they were climate activists. They came into it because they were selected to be plaintiffs for this case because they each were experiencing individual harms. Some of them were natural activists or leaders, like Kelsey and Shatescott and Vic. They had been doing climate activism work, and it was kind of something that preceded them becoming plaintiffs in this case. But I would say that for them, it's been amazing seeing them continue to be leaders and and really, to some degree, the face of this movement. But I think what was more, I don't know, like as a mother, to kind of see the development of some of these other plaintiffs who were more shy, maybe not as comfortable in front of the camera, kind of to some degree didn't completely understand what they were getting into. We're really coming at this from a different space of not being so comfortable in that realm of, talking to the media and doing interviews and all of that stuff, and to see just all of them blossom and become so comfortable in that role and so sure of their of their role as plaintiffs, and really understanding what their government has done and what their constitutional rights are. And they're so strong in their language and in their truths around what they talk about. And I think that's really been a joy to witness over the course of time.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a couple of characters there who were already quite active in their own rights before they joined the case. I'd love to pause for a moment to talk about Vic, because Vic happens to also be the protagonist of sort of a companion piece in a way that we're also presenting at Planet in Focus this year, called We Have Reached the Moment. And certainly anybody that has just seen Youth v. Gov, I would really urge them to watch that as well, because I think it's a really very complimentary. It's not at all sort of redundant. It's its own side episode, and it really focuses on the dynamic between Vic and Vic's father, and it's really quite an extraordinary relationship. I'm just curious what prompted you to capture that and sort of decide to do this mid-length sort of side story almost.
Yeah, I kind of always knew that 21 stories were not going to fit into this feature film, and that each of these stories were really important and valid to be telling. Each of these plaintiffs have, really compelling stories. And I think it along the way of getting to know Vic and talking with him and understanding that, he comes from a family that isn't completely supportive of what he does, or doesn't really understand, and that to me was a pretty compelling story that I wanted to follow. And I didn't know when we did it if it was going to fit into the feature or if it was going to be its own thing. We have a lot of extra footage of the other plaintiffs that we are creating ancillary content to go along with our impact campaign, that is able to highlight some of these other youth stories. But Vic's story with, his relationship with his father really stood out as kind of its own story that we wanted to tell about what it's first of all, what it's like for these young people to not have that support that I think most people assume they have, that they've been pushed into this by their parents, or that their parents have led the way for them on this journey. And that certainly has not been the case for Vic. So I think it helps to answer a lot of those questions, or perhaps misconceptions that people have about these young people. But I think it also is just a beautiful example of how we can talk and communicate with people around subjects that are really difficult, or that we have differing, stances and opinions and beliefs around. And Vic just so beautifully, shows what that empathy and compassion and patience and listening, just beautifully is an example of how we all can be having these really tough conversations.
I would also say that Vic's dad demonstrates the same. Like when you watch that film, if you come at climate change and understanding and interpreting the data that yes, it's real and it's human caused, and then to look at this, to understand this conversation, and that Vic's dad steps up and he's willing to listen and he wants to learn and he's open to what Vic has to say, and encourages and basically says to Vic that he'll meet him in the middle, like let's continue this conversation. So when I watched that film, in particular, I was really moved by Vic's dad in it too, and how I don't know, I felt like he sort of stepped up to meet his son in his place.
Yeah, it's the sort of interaction that I think in our moment that is polarized in so many ways, it was really refreshing to see two people who are starting with quite divergent points of view being able to sort of recognize, just the decency and the humanity in one another, and sort of forge their way towards a greater shared point of view, which is just, yeah, we need so much more of that, I think. It's obviously difficult to predict where the case will go from here, and how any appellate panels are likely to rule. But I'm wondering whether, sort of more broadly, you feel as though courts are likely to become more prominent or more central in the effort to counteract the climate emergency. I feel as though many of us probably wonder whether electoral politics are structurally kind of ill-suited to the long-term policymaking that the climate crisis demands, and also the political realm feels like a space, again, speaking about polarization, where it seems like people are acting oftentimes in bad faith, or lobbyists are exerting really outsized influence. It's actually, all of that is, I think, really effectively illustrated in the middle portion of your film. I suppose you can make the case that courts are becoming politicized to some degree as well these days, but Julia in the film talks about the courts having the advantage of being a space where you're bound by fact and evidence in the way that in the political realm, unfortunately, you're not. So given that facts and evidence seem to be very much on the side of climate activists these days, do you foresee courts being a more viable path going forward, sort of notwithstanding the issues that arise in this film around sort of justiciability? I forget now what the precise.
Julia talks about it, and also Professor Primus, who's a constitutional expert, talked about it in the film, that the courts are really there to provide protection to the citizens when the other two branches of government are engaged in harm, right? When the executive branch and the legislative branch here in the United States, according to our constitutional law, that the executive branch and the legislative branch, when they're failing and they are involved in willful actions that are harming the citizens of this country, the judicial system is supposed to be that third branch of equal government that is supposed to provide that protection and say, hey, you guys can't do this. This is the law. So I really do think that the power, I think that the courts ultimately, regardless of how polarized we may think they are, there still are laws and there still is a constitution. And I think at the end of the day, that the journey is hard and it's long, and there certainly have been many cases that have gone up to our Supreme Court in history that didn't always win the first time. But I think this is part of our process that we have to go through in order to protect our democracy. And this isn't just in the U.S. This case has inspired cases around the world, including in Canada. And there is, for your audience, there's an amazing case called LaRose versus Her Majesty the Queen. And I would really encourage everyone to follow that case. It's a wonderful group of young people and First Nations youth who are involved in this suit. And each of these cases, are young people bringing these cases forward to hold their governments accountable using their own country's constitutions. Mm-hmm. So even though, our governments may be functioning very differently around the world, like we all do still have these constitutions where these rights are in place and should be protected. And so I do think that the courts are, moving forward. We've seen that these decades of legislative actions and executive actions have not resulted in the climate policies that we need to move forward as urgently as we need. So I think the courts are definitely going to be a piece of the puzzle.
I would
Yeah.
add to that too, that the urgency part of it is when you look at this case and you watch Youth v. Gov and you see these children age through the course of the film, and
Mm-hmm.
you realize that the judicial system is slow moving and grinding. And I come away from that with like, this is something that needs to be fought on the climate crisis with every tool we have available to us, you know, pressuring our legislative branch, voting for people who have good climate agendas, you know, the same with the executive branch and the courts, because it's, you know, you see it in this film where 6 years into this case, 5.5 years into this case, it hasn't even gone to trial yet, you know, like, and the climate crisis, as we all see every season, is bearing down on us. So I think it all takes this sort of all the tools in the tool chest.
Mm-hmm.
We need to get the money out of our politics.
Right. Well, yeah, it's a slightly different context in Canada, but I wish I could say that that case LaRose had a smoother path in the courts. As I understand it, the most recent ruling in that case was against the plaintiffs for a reason that essentially the cause of action that they were alleging was almost sort of too broad. It feels as though you know, I guess the judge felt that the issue was framed in such a way that it was hard to sort of reach a specific ruling. So I do think, as you were saying, sometimes it takes a couple of cracks when you're crafting a case to sort of find the narrow legal issue, the narrow legal framing that will allow the courts to kind of do what they do. Whereas I think in this case, maybe incorrectly, that the judges felt as though, you know, they weren't in a position to kind of enforce a remedy and so on, even though we see that that's actually not what was being called for. But nonetheless,
you like totally understand the film, Julian. It's awesome.
I mean, I did. I guess I am a law school graduate, so maybe I have a slight inside track there. But nonetheless, I'd like to think that your film is again very accessible, even for those who may not.
Hope
but
so.
I'm mindful of our time, so just to maybe wrap up the conversation. At the end of your film, there's a URL that folks can visit, youthvgovfilm.com, if they'd like to lend their support. What sort of impact initiatives are you pursuing around the film, and what will viewers find when they visit the website?
Yeah, we're really excited about our impact campaign. We've been working for a couple years on developing it and figuring out what tools and tactics that we want to use. Our main goal is to engage and support young people in holding their governments accountable. And when we say governments, we mean anything, you know, from your local school board to your city council, you know, state representatives, all the way up to the federal government. There's all kinds of ways that young people can plug in, and there's all kinds of ways that the older generations can support those young people in that work. And so, you know, we're really looking to really, you know, work with other local nonprofits on the ground and, you know, really engaging our audience with local actions that they can take to create, you know, these changes that we need on the ground, because we know that even if the courts do rule in their favor, so much of this change is going to have to come from the ground up locally. And so we really want to support and engage young people in that way. We also are working, you know, behind the scenes with, you know, trying to influence or at least do outreach within the Biden administration to make them aware that they have the opportunity right now with the case. They've been ordered to begin settlement discussions. And so there's a big opportunity for them to, you know, enact their climate policy through a court-supported resolution that would be much more robust than any legislative or executive actions that could be taken. And Olivia, maybe you want to share a little bit about our educational goals that we have.
Yeah, I mean, we feel like this film is so well poised to make an impact on students because they can see themselves with their age and diversity reflected in the film. We would like to make the film available for middle schools and high schools. We're already getting a lot of screening requests from universities and colleges. And there's also, from an educational standpoint, having this film viewed in law schools so we can inspire the next generation of Julia Olsons, and looking at law as a way of, doing good in the world too, and tackling some really big issues. So that the story itself, I think, lends itself perfectly to be used in educational settings from those different levels. So we'd like to develop some curriculums, especially for the middle and high school age, possibly a case study on the Juliana versus United States case that could accompany the film in law school teaching. So yeah, we're starting to get our footing in that, and it's just really exciting seeing young people from, like a whole range of young people, like really just understand the film and feel inspired by it, and kind of angered by the story too, like ready to claim their rights. It's great.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for both your efforts in making the film in the first place, but then also carrying the work forward in the ways that you've just described. It's really wonderful to see.
Thanks, Julian.
Yeah, thank you, Julian. Thanks for the wonderful talk back. That was great.
Thank you, and thank you to those who are watching. We hope you enjoyed Youth Speak Of, and we hope you are able to see a few more great films at Planet in Focus this year.